Though usually unintended and often unrecognized, much of behavioral science is a value-laden enterprise. Kaplan, 1964. Silverstein and Auerbach, 1999. Research questions that are regarded as appropriate or sensible at a particular point in time are usually situated within a matrix of cultural beliefs often widely accepted within the dominant population at large, but certainly within the scientific community more specifically. The issue of fatherhood is a case in point. Fatherhood is a cultural construction, Doherty, Kouneski, and Erickson, 1998, and once formulated it has implications for the subsequent behavior of those who share the beliefs and assumptions defining that construction. The issue here is to understand the meanings commonly associated in the United States with the concepts of father, fatherhood, and fathering, and to recognize the constraints that are implicitly placed on one's behaviors as a result of accepting these meanings, i.e., cultural construction, as being true. Of course, to understand fully the cultural construction of fatherhood, one must also understand its counterpoint, motherhood. And one must also understand that both constructions are influenced by cultural conceptions of masculinity and femininity. It is not our intention here, however, to disentangle the maze of meanings and behavioral implications of all of these conceptions and relationships, but merely to acknowledge that they exist. For now we want only to dwell on the cultural meaning of fatherhood in America in relation to motherhood, and to explore the implications of this conception for behavioral science research on parent-child relationships. For most Americans, the concepts father, fatherhood, and fathering appear to connote very different domains of behavior and effect from the concepts mother, motherhood, and mothering. Semantically, the cultural construction of fathering, for example, implies nothing about father love as does the genderized equivalent of mother love that is contained semantically in the construct mothering. The word mothering elicits, for many, a warm, fuzzy, nurtured feeling, whereas the term fathering elicits feelings of something stronger, colder, harder, and less affectionate. Rohner, 1995. The term father love is not used in everyday discourse, but mother love is. Even the phrase father love sounds strange to some, yet many feel comforted by mother love. Rohner, 1995. Popular literature is filled with references to both mothering and parenting when referring to caregiving. But the term fathering is almost never used in this context. When used, the term is typically found in the context of a question who begot whom. Even the gender-neutral term parent is often used, or interpreted as being synonymous with mother. And we have found in our own teaching that students, including advanced graduate students, often misread and even mishear the term paternal as being parental, which is then sometimes translated as maternal/mother. In some respects, the conception of fatherhood has shifted dramatically over the course of the last 300 years of American history. Lamb, 2000. According to E. H. Pleck and Pleck, 1997, for example, the ideal image of the colonial European American father in the 1600s and 1700s was that of the stern patriarch. From 1830 to 1900, the ideal image of father was one of the distant breadwinner. From 1900 to 1970, the ideal father was the genial playmate dad and gender role model. And from the 1970s to today, the ideal image of father is said to be one who is a co-parent, sharing equally with his mate in the care of their children. This portrayal of the cultural conception of the ideal father is greatly oversimplified, of course, but it does contain important ideas that have been widely shared, and it shows how cultural conceptions of fatherhood have shifted over time. One of the most enduring historical elements defining fatherhood has nothing to do with rearing children, but deals with the assumption that the major role of fathers within the family is as economic provider. The breadwinner, La Rosa, 1997. Throughout much of the 20th century and earlier, beginning with the advent of industrialization in the 19th century, many American men judged themselves, and were judged by others, judged their personal worth, and judged their success as husbands and fathers, in relation to their ability to provide economically for their families. Stearns, 1991. Since the 1940s, this essential role has been de-emphasized somewhat, although it has not been altogether abandoned or replaced. The shared ideology of male breadwinning was used by many researchers over the course of the 20th century to explain fathers' apparently limited involvement in childcare. Griswold, 1993. More important, however, many behavioral scientists prior to the 1960s and 1970s assumed that fathers were relatively unimportant for the healthy development of their children in any case. Cabrera, Tamis Lamonda, Bradley, Hoffath and Lamb, 2000, Nash, 1965, Rapoport, Strelitz and Q, 1977. At the very most, fathers were thought to be peripheral to the job of parenting because children spent most of their time with their mothers. Some even argued that fathers have no biological aptitude for childcare, though women were said to be genetically endowed for it. Amato, 1998, Belsky, 1998, Benson, 1968. These conceptions seem to have led in the popular press and in many television portrayals during the 1950s and 1960s to an image of the irrelevant, mindless, ineffectual, sometimes bumbling and incompetent father. Mackey, 1996. Not all literary and visual portrayals of fathers were negative, however. For example, movies and television series such as Make Room for Daddy, Father Knows Best, The Cosby Show, and others portrayed warm, loving, involved, and competent fathers. Similarly, some 19th and 20th century novels described loving, concerned, and competent fathers. Bob Cratchit in Dickens' 1843, A Christmas Carol, and Atticus Finch and Lee's 1960, To Kill a Mockingbird are two cases in point. And even though comic strip fathers were sometimes lampooned in the 20th century as being bumbling incompetents, La Rosa, Jarrett, Gadgel, and Wynne, 2000, also showed that these characters were frequently portrayed from 1940 to 1999 as being nurturant, supportive, and capable fathers. The cultural conception of fathers as being a relatively inconsequential influence in child development has its counterpoint in an assumption about the primacy of mothers and mother love. We commented earlier on the latter issue. Now we amplify on the topic by pointing out that virtually all of the influential theories of child development during the past century accepted the unproven premise that mothers are most important in child development. For example, psychoanalytic theory specifically and psychodynamic theories more generally assumed that the mother-child relationship, especially during the first 6 years of life, is crucial for normal child development. Early attachment theory too focused on the mother-child bond, as did significant portions of learning theory and cognitive developmental theory. Lamb, 1975, 1981, 1986, Fez, 1992, 1996. With this phalanx of distinguished theories converging on a view that was widely believed in America anyway, few developmental researchers in the first half of the 20th century thought it essential to inquire directly about fathers' influence in child development. Shared wisdom asserted that competent and nurturant mothering was all children really needed for successful cognitive, social, and emotional development. Bronstein and Hahn, 1988. Or, as one distinguished researcher wrote in an anonymous review of this article, "We spent a lot of time studying mothers because we thought they were important, not because we thought fathers weren't." Cultural assumptions such as these about fathering are related to widely shared assumptions about appropriate gender role and gender identity of both men and women. In this regard, most Americans, men as well as women, seem to have associated childcare with feminine behavior. Until a decade or so ago, many Americans regarded it as unmasculine for men to spend much time caring for children, except as a temporary backup and support to the mothers. A common theoretical assumption found even as recently as the 1970s and 1980s asserted that fathers' major contribution to child development was indirect, through their economic and emotional support of mothers. Biller, 1993, McCoby and Martin, 1983. This premise may be summarized as follows. The most important contribution a father can make to his children is achieved through providing for and loving their mother. In summary, the widely held cultural construction of fatherhood prior to the 1970s, and still held by many today, has two strands. One deals with fathers' competence as caregivers, and the other deals with the influence of fathering on child development. The first strand asserts that fathers are often incompetent and may be even biologically unsuited to the job of child rearing. The maternal counterpoint is that women are genetically endowed for childcare. The second strand asserts that fathers' influence in child development is relatively unimportant, or at least peripheral or indirect. The maternal counterpoint is that mother love and competent maternal care provide everything that children need for normal, healthy development. The effect of internalizing these cultural beliefs as one's own personal beliefs seems to have led to sometimes unintended and unrecognized but nonetheless real consequences. The most notable outcome of acting on these beliefs throughout most of the 20th century was to minimize fathers' presence in much of mainstream behavioral science research, as well as in clinical research. Fez, 1997. Because it was assumed that mothers but not necessarily fathers were important in child development, researchers tended to study mostly mothers' behavior. Of course, they found significant effects of maternal behavior that served to motivate researchers even further to study mothers. But a subtle side effect of these results also seemed to reinforce researchers' belief that fathers must not be all that important, because mothers were being shown to be so very important. Moreover, behavioral scientists and clinical practitioners felt further justified in excluding fathers from their work because mothers spend the greatest amount of time with children, and therefore it was reasoned that they must also have the greatest influence on children's development as well as on treatment outcomes. Verholt and Goet, 1982, Fez, 1996. Finally, fathers tended to be omitted from research and treatment models because they were assumed to be inaccessible as a result of their out-of-home economic responsibilities. The relatively little research that included fathers prior to 1970 dealt with a variety of issues, but seldom with father love per se. This omission seems to have been encouraged by the widespread tendency among both researchers and theorists to accept without question the assumption that fathers express less affection and understanding toward children than do mothers. Walters and Stinnett, 1971, page 102. Indeed, many behavioral scientists and clinicians seem to accept the postulate that father's major role in the family was in the instrumental domain, whereas mother's major role was in the expressive affective domain. Parsons and Bales, 1955. Acceptance of these assumptions resulted in very limited research specifically examining the relationship between father love and child outcomes.